A big thank you again to everyone for joining us today, and let's get started. Our first speaker is Ana. Ana?
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you so much to the Opportunity Agenda for developing this incredibly important resource for communities, for policymakers, for people who are worried about the attacks that immigrant communities are facing under the Trump White House. Since the election of Donald Trump in 2016, the plight of immigrant communities in the United States has become dire. The new administration, I guess not so new anymore, has already taken steps to increase the speed and the scale of deportations, while significantly expanding the power of the immigration enforcement agencies. And in the face of these threats, there is a large and growing and powerful movement of advocates, of community leaders, organizers, local governments that are developing strategies to support immigrant communities. These efforts build on a long-standing work by local elected officials and organizers and community organizations to advance policies that include and protect immigrants. Many jurisdictions around the country have passed policies to stop the federal government from co-opting local resources for the enforcement of immigration laws. And these localities have come to be known as sanctuary cities or sanctuary counties or sanctuary states. So in the era of Trump, it is clear that the exercise of local power is more vital than ever. And we know that the Trump administration is fixated on implementing its deportation machine. They have aggressively started to put pieces in place, from ending DACA, ending TPS, passing executive actions to undermine the power of cities, pushing debates in Congress that further punish and penalize and intimidate local elected officials that are trying to protect our communities and our people. So again, the work of the Opportunity Agenda in this moment is crucial, and we are so deeply thankful. The Center for Popular Democracy is a network of community organizations, many rooted in immigrant communities, that have been fighting to build power and to advance a vision of an inclusive society. And we know that it is not possible to advance this vision alone, that this is work that has to be done by communities, by elected officials, by allies, and that in order to get to where we want to go, to a place where all of us are safe and all of us are free, we need to be able to shape the conversation, to imbue our values in the public debate around policies, to move the hearts and minds of people and to transform the culture. And so that's why it is so important to be able to have this research that the Opportunity Agenda has done to help us understand kind of how the sanctuary cities debate, how to redefine it so that it can better kind of help us achieve the goals of advancing towards a vision where all of us can be safe with our families, with our communities, and live with a measure of dignity and respect that we all deserve. So let me end by saying we are so lucky to be in this conversation with all of you.
Outstanding. Ana Maria, thank you very, very, very much. You were mentioning redefining sanctuary and how to reframe the debate. And so I'd like to turn this over to Lucy, who is going to walk us through the findings of the report. Lucy, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much, Michael and Ana, for that introduction. My name is Lucy Odigi-Turley. I'm the Public Opinion and Media Research Coordinator. I'm the Manager of Research and Evaluation. Just got change my title, at the Opportunity Agenda. And today I'm going to be walking you through top line findings from our latest report, Redefining Sanctuary, which is a three-part analysis of social media, discourse, existing public opinion research, and media content over the last 18 months from January 2016 to June 2017. So before I walk you through what some of our top line findings, I want to kind of take a step back and talk a little bit about some of our research questions and goals going into the research, Also a tidbit, as I'm walking you through the findings, I'm going to be talking about sanctuary cities, sanctuary jurisdictions, and sanctuary policies. Sometimes I use the phrase interchangeably. There are nuances, and you can find more details about that in our full report, which is on our website. So going into the research project, we were working with our partners at the Center for Popular Democracy, and like a lot of you listening today, we were concerned by what we felt was what we felt was an uptick in kind of overt anti-immigrant and xenophobic discourse in political rhetoric. And along with the discourse, we saw directly following the election a series of executive orders, of policies that were overtly anti-immigrant, which aimed to really implement mass deportation efforts and specifically targeted so-called sanctuary cities and sanctuary jurisdictions. We also saw policies like SB4 in Texas being implemented at the local, at the state level. So we wanted to take a step back and really understand, as talk of sanctuary cities became more prominent in both political and media conversations, how were people, members of the public, processing all of this information? How were they understanding these different policy debates? So from this kind of level of concern and our conversation with our partners, we came up with 3 central questions. So what were the issues and policies that were currently shaping the overall immigration debate as seen in social media discourse, as seen in media coverage, and also a little bit in public opinion, existing public opinion research? How were these conversations currently intersecting with one another? So were audiences connecting conversations about sanctuary cities and sanctuary policies with conversations about DACA and Dreamers? So again, we wanted to see if this was bubbling up in social media discourse and in media coverage of the issues. And the most crucial thing we wanted to do was figure out how pro-immigrant advocates could ensure the continued support of immigrants and their families in an increasingly anti-immigrant climate, when a lot of people, members of immigrant communities, particularly undocumented immigrants, are no longer definitely more in a space where they do not feel comfortable or really feel at risk speaking out or taking action in the movement. So how did we go about doing that? So as I said, this was a 3-part analysis. The first component was a social media analysis. We used a tool called Crimson Hexagon to extract data from multiple social media sources, Facebook, Twitter, forums such as 4chan and Reddit, and also comments from news media sources. So we extracted data from the period January 1st, 2016 to June 1st, 2017, and that kind of more longitudinal time frame allowed us to kind of identify trends over time. The second component was a public opinion analysis of existing survey data and public opinion studies, and we really had a central focus on studies that had been published since November 2016. And the final component was a media content analysis. So we randomly sampled 50 news media articles from national, regional, and local publications, also within that time frame of January 1st, 2016 and June 1st, 2017, in order to do some kind of cross-media analysis to see if the conversations happening on social media correlated or intersected with the way that the media was covering the issue. So the first set of findings come from that first section, the social media analysis. So what did we find? We found that references to sanctuary cities specifically, but also sanctuary jurisdictions and sanctuary policies have increased significantly in online discourse. So as you see in this chart here, if I can draw your attention to the furthest left-hand corner, you see in January 2016, really throughout much of the year, you see generally conversations about sanctuary cities were generally averaging around 100K unique social media posts a month. But then all of a sudden, you see that there's a significant uptick around November 2016 in line with the election. And then there's an even more drastic spike in January 2017, which was a direct result of a series of executive orders issued by the Trump administration in January 2017. So even though there has been a slight decline since January 2017, this higher level of engagement has sustained. So what you're seeing now is generally between 300 to 400K unique social media posts around the issue of sanctuary cities and sanctuary jurisdictions online. So that's a significant online audience that we could potentially be engaging with. We also found that references to SB4, Texas's SB4, which has been, the so-called anti-sanctuary legislation, and Trump, references to Trump, dominated online discourse in the 18-month period that we examined. So you see here that around 19% of extracted posts within our sample included some reference to SB4. 16% had a reference to immigrants and deportation, whereas 10% had references to Trump. 9% had references to illegal, which shows that we really need to do a lot more work changing the language around immigration. The fact that undocumented immigrant isn't it's not even in the top 20 list, shows that that is not a phrase that is still commonly used. Illegal immigrant is still a phrase that is used even by people who would tend to be more towards supporting pro-immigrant policies, because the language really is still very much dominated by a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric. You see here also that 7% of posts included the phrase earning less than minimum wage, and this is related to one particular social media post that was shared over 27,000 times, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later on in the presentation. So another interesting finding is that the issue of racial profiling is currently siloed in online conversations related to sanctuary cities and sanctuary jurisdictions and sanctuary policies. So what does that mean? So one of the analyses that we are able to complete is something called a cluster analysis. And so what that does is it helps visualize some of the most frequently used terms included in social media posts. And it also shows not only the most frequently used terms, which will appear in bigger, more bolder lettering, but also the phrases and terms that are most likely to be associated with these terms. So you see here in the blue bubble, deportation is most likely, it's one of a very prominent term that occurred in social media posts, but also was more likely to occur with phrases illegals, families against, people against deportation, president, ICE, country, force, and judge. We see another cluster which includes, in green, deportations and Trump. And this really is focusing on discussions around the border wall and deportation. Undocumented immigrants appears here for the first time. We see conversations around deportation, Obama and Trump. So a lot of arguments about the fact that even though there has been an uptick, deportation facing undocumented immigrants has been a long-standing issue facing the nation. We see here sanctuary is a prominent term and generally discussed in relation to cities, federal, Texas's SB4, and order. But racial profiling is off to the side in gray in its own separate bubble, and it's generally mentioned in relation to police. And so there is a conversation happening online about racial profiling, somewhat in the context of sanctuary jurisdictions and sanctuary cities, but they're not necessarily being connected. And so that means that audiences maybe need a little bit more information or guidance in terms of the implications that policies like SB4 present in terms of police accountability and the policing of immigrant communities and the potential risk of increased racial profiling. A positive finding is that pro-immigrant voices currently dominate online discussions. So earlier on, I mentioned that 7% of the social media posts that we extracted included the phrase earning less than minimum wage. And that appears to be a direct result of the social media posts on the left. So this is a screenshot of a video that was shared more than 27,000 times as of June 2017. So what the video depicts is an agricultural farm worker, also an immigrant, who was packing strawberries very, very quickly. And so the accompanied text said, imagine doing this all day, earning less than minimum wage, and then being called lazy. So this really resonated with online audiences. You can see here it received more than 75,000 likes. Another image that also received a lot of retweets and sharing online was this image of a schoolgirl holding the sign "Here to Stay," which has now become a really popular hashtag. So pro-immigrant voices and also the images that depict immigrant communities basically just living their life, working, fathers, mothers, parents. These are the images that are really resonating online and concurrently are dominating conversations about sanctuary jurisdictions. So the second set of findings are going to be from our analysis of existing public opinion data. So trends in public opinion data over the year have consistently shown an American public who not only view diversity as a strength, but see immigration as a national strength. And we found a similar trend in our analysis. So 64% of Americans in our analysis as of June 2017 see immigration as a national strength. They see it as something that adds to the economy and also to the culture of the nation. But underlying that kind of seeing immigration as something positive was what we saw was something that was very much a key segment of the population who's very malleable when it comes to immigration, and particularly when immigration is discussed in the context of crime and also in relation to taxation. So what we found is that while the majority of Americans continue to see immigration in abstract, broad terms as something positive, when you talk on a more granular level and ask questions about the impact immigration has on their daily lives, crime, tax rate, the feel of a community, you begin to see a divergence of opinion. So what I'm going to do now is draw your attention to the top line, the black line. So Gallup has been asking a question since 2001. The question is, does immigration to the United States make the crime situation in the country better, worse, or does it have no effect, not much effect? So you see in 2001, and really until 2004, there wasn't much movement in response to that question. So around 50 to 45% of Americans surveyed felt that immigration makes the crime situation worse. Then we see a significant uptick in 2007 when nearly 60% of those questioned felt that the immigration makes the crime situation worse. Now, 2007 was the year that the Great Recession really kind of like took off steam, and we do find, and it has been traditionally found in public opinion research, that anti-immigrants and general kind of resentment towards communities of color increases significantly in times of economic crisis. So it has decreased significantly since 2007. As of June 2017, 45% of those surveys feel that that immigration makes the crime situation worse. But this has significant implications, not only for the fact that since 2001 there has been little movement in terms of the percentage of Americans who feel that way, but also for its impact on levels of support for specific policies, specifically for people's perceptions of sanctuary cities and sanctuary jurisdictions. So in our analysis, we found that perceptions of safety specifically have a direct impact on support for or willingness to live in a sanctuary jurisdiction. So in a February 2017 study, respondents were first asked whether or not they believe sanctuary cities are safer, sanctuary cities are less safe, or sanctuary cities are about the same. So we see here on the top line that for those 36% of those who believe that sanctuary cities are safer also favor living in a sanctuary city, while 7% oppose living in a sanctuary city. In the middle line, we see that only 11% of people who believe that sanctuary cities are less safe also favor living in a sanctuary city, where 64% oppose living in a sanctuary city. And on the final line, you see about 48% of people who believe sanctuary cities are about the same, for some reason less than those who believe it's safer, but people, again, are contradictory, would actually also favor living in a sanctuary city, as then 21% oppose living in a sanctuary city. So this is really important. So while generally, as I said, people very much view immigration as a positive thing that adds to their lives, they're very, very malleable, particularly when the conversation about crime is included. And that's a really important finding, and it's a really great segue to our final section, which is the media content analyses, because the question of criminality and the attempt to criminalize immigrant communities is a key component of our findings of our media content analyses. So, similar to social media, we found that media coverage of sanctuary policies and sanctuary cities has increased significantly since January 2016. So as you see here, January 2016 to October 2016 really generated only a fraction of the percentage of total media coverage of sanctuary jurisdictions. Similar to social media discourse, you see an immediate spike in engagement beginning in November 2016, and then this again spikes again in January 2017, again as a direct result of the Trump administration's executive orders. And again, media engagement with sanctuary cities has sustained, but not so much in the same way that you see in social media engagement, because the media, of course, is a different beast. And so they've, moved on to different issues, but there's still a higher level of engagement now than there was preceding the 2016 election. So back to the issue of safety and crime, we found that a significant portion of the news articles in our sample focused on the issue of public safety and the rule of law. So 32% of articles, of the 50 articles we randomly sampled, touched on this issue. Specifically, they touched on the issue of, or what they felt, or reported on the issue, and parentheses there, of undocumented immigrants committing crime. And so these type of publications or coverage typically featured both pro and anti-immigrant voices arguing about whether or not sanctuary cities encourage a breakdown in public safety. So there was a lot of myth busting. Even people who were pro-immigrants had to kind of fall into that frame and kind of defend undocumented immigrant communities, or immigrant communities as basically not causing crime levels. So that was a significant focus of media coverage. Also, we see here 25% of articles in our sample focused on anti-immigrant legislation, specifically the executive orders that were sent out in January 2017, and also the SP4 Texas legislation. Then another interesting finding is the fact that 18% of coverage in this period focused simply on defining what sanctuary cities were. So that really included media outlets calling on legal and policy experts to explain or kind of give a definition of sanctuary cities or sanctuary jurisdictions, and also to interpret the implications of the executive order. A bulk of that, the majority of that coverage focused on a particular measure about withholding of federal funds from so-called sanctuary cities. So again, there seems to be a lot of ambiguity in terms of people's understanding of what sanctuary cities and sanctuary policies entail. A significant portion of coverage also focused on challenging the Trump administration, specifically elected officials and community members who really were standing up to the increased ICE raids that we saw at the beginning of the year, and also some of the provisions in the executive orders that were issued. And a really important finding was that while pro-immigrant advocates or spokespeople tended to actually dominate media coverage, a significant portion of quotes that were included in media sources were from anti-immigrant spokespeople. And not only were they made up a significant portion of total quotes, but they also were extremely coordinated and consistent in their messaging. So a significant portion of anti-immigrant spokespeople quotes originated from a single source, which was the Center for Immigration Studies, which has been identified by the Southern Policy Law Center as a hate group. The Center for Immigration Studies generally focused on undocumented immigrants committing crime, and always, I don't think there was a single exception, made reference to a single case in San Francisco, which was the death of Catherine Steinle. So that featured heavily in anti-immigrant quotes, and it was consistently referenced. So now I'm going to walk you through, I just presented a lot of data and information. So what can you do with that information? So the recommendations. So as I mentioned before, a key finding of our research, and one of the most troubling things, is the fact that one, mention of crime or discussion of crime really kind of impacts a significant portion of the public perception and level of support for pro-immigrant policies. And people are extremely malleable, particularly when the discussions of crime and violence come into the conversation of immigration. So it's important for people, advocates, when they're talking about sanctuary cities, for them to kind of frame them, to put the frame forth that sanctuary cities are about being strong communities, and really avoid references to crime and violence and falling into that frame. And so that means avoiding myth busting, because that's just going to reinforce the connection between sanctuary jurisdictions and crime in people's minds. It's really important to uplift the many successes of many kind of thriving and safe and, really kind of functioning sanctuary jurisdictions. Also expand what that means. There are sanctuary campuses. It's not just the city. So really kind of describe to people what that is, and uplift successes of programs like DACA, which is a program that public opinion studies consistently show has high levels of public support. It's necessary to reframe the discussion by focusing on what happens when immigrants can fully participate. So you saw that images of immigrants working, living, going to school were some of the most shared content on social media. And these are things that are really resonating with audiences online. So it's important to show and tell those stories. But that also requires that we talk about immigrants as more than just immigrants, their parents, their students, their neighbors, there are teachers. And so you need to present that alternative so that people can move towards that alternative. Connected to that, it's necessary for us to define for our audiences what sanctuary policies are and do. So as I mentioned earlier in our analysis of media coverage of sanctuary cities and sanctuary jurisdictions, we found that a significant portion of time was spent just defining for the audiences what this was. And so if we don't define what sanctuary policies are and are intended to do, then anti-immigrant advocates will do that for us. So we need to draw on the themes of safety and of refuge. These themes help audiences to better understand the critical role that sanctuary jurisdictions play. And finally, we need to use other descriptors along with talking about sanctuary policy. So sanctuary cities has become somewhat of a buzzword, particularly in media coverage and political discourse. Now, whilst we would not recommend, and some people have decided that they no longer want to make use of the term, but terms will always be co-opted, movements will always be co-opted. And so what we need to do is, again, provide descriptors so people understand what this phrase really means. So advocates should use other descriptors that kind of add to the phrase or the term sanctuary cities or sanctuary jurisdictions, like places where people, including our immigrant neighbors, can contribute and participate. But if people are looking for alternative words to use alongside sanctuary cities or sanctuary jurisdictions, many of our advocates have begun using welcoming cities and immigrant welcoming cities. So I went through a lot of information. So for anyone interested in taking a deeper dive into the findings, it's available. The full report is available on our website, opportunityagenda.org. For those interested in more specific questions about the methodology and the recommendations, please feel free to email me. And please follow along or ask any questions following the hashtag #LoveYourNeighbor. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Michael.
Thank you very, very much, Lucy. Lucy was right. She covered a lot of ground. So if I can, I just want to bring some of our panelists into the discussion a little bit to talk about their experiences for a few minutes before we turn it over to the listeners for questions. Alisa, I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about your own work around sanctuary policies and how it intersects with some of the key findings discussed today?
Sure. Thanks, Michael. So for those of you who don't know the Immigrant Defense Project, we are an organization based in New York City, and we fight for justice and human rights of immigrants in both the criminal and immigration systems. We work to end mass criminalization, detention, and deportation through a multi-strong strategy that includes community defense, advocacy, litigation, legal support, and strategic communications. So at IDP, we've focused for years on policies that protect immigrants from entering the criminal legal system in the first place, and then from being turned over to ICE or put on ICE's radar once they're there. hear a bad echo now. That's better.
Was that your musical accompaniment?
Yeah, exactly. A little background sound.
Okay. Yeah.
Is that okay? Great.
Yeah, that's fine.
So we helped pass the first detainer policy in the country, limiting ICE and jails from turning people over to immigration, and supported and worked closely with folks doing similar campaigns across the country. We've also been part of efforts, just to give a little more background, to push back against secure communities, the short-lived priority enforcement program, 287G programs, ICE raids, ICE in courts, and other ICE law enforcement collusion. And then on the criminal legal side, we've worked on building up holistic public defense for immigrants and on criminal legal reforms that prevent people from entering those systems in the first place and ensuring more just outcomes for those who are in it. So for us, it's always been critical to not use language that divides our communities or feeds into the good immigrant versus bad immigrant narrative, such as sayings like "we are not criminals" or saying that certain people, particularly immigrants who have convictions, do deserve deportation. And that's for a few reasons. One is that that's the folks that we work with. We work with undocumented folks, green card holders, asylees, and others who've had some criminal legal system contact. And those are often the people that have been the most targeted, and who falls into that category of criminalized person has obviously grown extensively under the Trump administration to include, more and more people who are being criminalized just for not having status as well. Secondly, we know it doesn't work, and I think a lot of the opportunity agenda research and other research out there shows that saying something like "we are not criminals" just reinforces in people's minds that connection. And then, for us, I think the most important reason is that we really think it undermines long-term goals around pushing back against criminalization, mass incarceration, mass detention, deportation, and particularly undermines alliance building between communities of color who are doing that work. So the things that most kind of resonated for me from the work that the Opportunity Agenda did is, I'll just kind of quickly go through a couple points. One is talking about a vision of what true safety really looks like. We found that kind of retaking back that word safety and redefining it for, to mean safety from state violence, investments in things that actually make people safe, like housing and healthcare. And we've worked with, survivor groups that talk about criminalization and deportation is not the answer. And then really talking about how ICE policies make people less safe, like in our courthouse work, being scared to even go to court. And we've worked with Unlikely Allies to make a lot of those statements. And another point from OA that I think makes a lot of sense to us and has resonated in our work is really kind of calling out Trump's racist agenda and the tactics he's using and naming it as, politicians playing on fear, trying to divide us, rather than always kind of delving deep into the sort of story of the moment that a media personality might want you to focus on. Third, talking about racial profiling, I think that is something that we've been doing more and more, and we find really resonates, especially when we're talking about pushing back on criminal justice policies that disproportionately target communities of color and lead to more immigrants being on ICE's radar, and is especially powerful in talking about 287G programs. And then last, I'll just say the need to explain what these policies are. I think sanctuary just means so many different things to different people, and being clear about what that means, especially when you're thinking about the motivations of different audiences.
Terrific. Alisa, thank you very, very much. I want to make sure I bring in Frances Valdez. Frances, Alisa was talking about a vision of true safety. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your own work around sanctuary policies and how it might intersect with some of the findings discussed today, but also some of the things that Alisa was talking about.
Sure. Thanks for the invitation. I'm calling from Houston, Texas, where most of the work that I've done with United We Dream has happened, and throughout Texas. And so just real quickly about United We Dream. United We Dream empowers the undocumented community to develop their leadership, their organizing skills, and to develop their own campaigns to fight for justice and dignity for immigrants and all people. And this is achieved through immigrant youth-led campaigns at the local, state, and federal level. And that's really the involvement in terms of this information. In Houston, a group of undocumented youth got together around 2015 in the fall to figure out how to start changing the system in a deeper way, and really defined that the Harris County Jail was this epicenter of oppression in Harris County for not only the undocumented community, but the Latinx and Black and low income and queer, especially transgender community in Houston. And so that led to the campaign to end 287G, which used multiple tactics. But I think, it was before the 2016 election, we were already thinking about these ideas around how do we change things at the local level, but not really using the word sanctuary. Actually, the word sanctuary has been a bad word in Texas for a long time, and so we've kind of had to figure out how to talk about these issues for a while now with local officials who for a long time were often saying that they had nothing to do with immigration, that's at the federal level, and really wanting to just pass the buck on these issues. So even with the ending of 287G in 2017, as everyone knows, Texas was really just being hammered at the state level and also at the federal level. There was the sheriff, Sally Hernandez in Austin, Texas, who was trying to go forth on her campaign promises to limit collaboration with ICE, who then all of a sudden Austin got a lot of raids in the area and was really targeted by the president as well as the governor. And so, really trying to, in this really difficult climate, Texas has always been conservative, as most people know, and now it's even to this other extreme with issues like SB4 that we've really never seen. A lot of people might not believe it, but Texas actually doesn't have a history of being this anti-immigrant. We've actually, although conservative, has not actually, when everything happened in Arizona, even the then Governor Rick Perry said that we would never do something like that here. So there's really been a shift, and so we've really just been trying to uplift all of the different ways at different levels that local officials can support the immigrant community, but it has been difficult with the fact that the state really understands how to use this system, especially the criminal justice system that is built to really criminalize people of color, and using SB4 as a way to use that system that already does partake in racial profiling and disproportionate confinement of people of color, and figuring out how to use it to deport more people. And so some things that I heard, actually, one of the last slides mentioned welcoming cities, actually made me cringe a little bit here, because in Houston, that's actually been a really difficult term for us because, again, like I said, the governor of Texas was actually tweeting about sanctuary cities long before the November 2016 election, and was preparing for the Texas legislative session in 2017, and trying to define sanctuary as a bad thing, and did a very good job of it. So already local officials in Texas knew they would not use that word, and so the Houston mayor says that we are a welcoming city, but has yet to actually do anything to really move policy in a meaningful way for the immigrant community. And so what we find, and I think it was talked about in the report, is I think it is difficult because with a lot of these terms and the positioning that happens, they can often be meaningless words at times when we need real action. And so, at this point, it's a difficult moment because everyone is very fearful, I feel, in Texas, especially at the local level, for retaliation at the state and federal level.
Great, thank you, Frances and Alisa. I'm curious. We were talking about the criminalization of immigrants and immigrant communities. What are some of the tensions and challenges both of you have faced in your work? Frances, I'd like to start with you, and then I'll go to Alisa.
Yeah, I think, I mentioned some of it. I think it's been difficult when you live in a place where people are very afraid to say sanctuary. They just won't say it, and then they say welcoming city, and there's really nothing behind it. I think that a big tension that I've felt in Texas since the election was, like I said, local officials not ever seeing themselves as true social justice or immigrant rights or civil rights leaders, and us needing them to be that in this moment, and then having to resist in a very strong way when it feels like they're just very fearful. So that's difficult. And then the tensions, around the ideas of criminality, I think that were brought up in the report are always a tension. We see it on the ground where people, if you don't have the perfect story of someone who doesn't always behave in the way everyone thinks they should, people often blame the individual. And another thing I saw in the report that I think was really important was this idea that people don't understand how systems really work. And again, going back to the criminal justice system and how it targets certain people, that racial profiling is an issue that deals with criminal justice, but also immigrants. And so really having to define those issues for the public, but even in the immigrant community themselves. And then I think the challenge is always making sure that the voice of the immigrant community themselves actually comes out, that the voice, regardless of it maybe not being the story that people think should come out, that the immigrant community defines the narrative for themselves in an empowering way.
Yeah. Thanks. Alisa?
Yeah, I think, a lot of the tensions that we've seen are kind of echo what Frances said. One is, I think we've struggled with whether to embrace the term sanctuary at all, and, thinking about what does it actually mean. And I think there's kind of different tensions that are part of that. One is, does it overpromise what the reality is for immigrant communities in a world where ICE can still conduct home raids? ICE is getting more and more access to data, like we've seen the latest where they're getting data from private companies that, read license plates. And so are we giving a false sense of security even where we've won significant gains, limiting, some collusion between law enforcement and ICE? We still know that there are risks out there. And so there's that aspect of it. And I think there's a tension around how does it interplay with the experience of communities of color around policing and policies like broken windows policing that do not feel like a sanctuary. And so I think there can be some tension of saying, oh yeah, we're a sanctuary city, and often the same politicians that are, saying that and heralding it and doing good work towards that end are still, supporting policing policies that can undermine it. And then, kind of to go to what Frances was saying, I do think, there are some places where we and allies and a lot of the folks on this call have gotten sheriffs or local counties who maybe aren't with us on the politics to pass, strong policies that limit their ability to collude with ICE, but more for reasons because they're scared of getting sued or because they've been convinced it's unconstitutional to hold someone without a judicial warrant. And so I think that we've seen some of those sheriffs run away from those policies when they've been called sanctuary policies because they then feel like they're associated with politicians that are more with us on, it as a human rights issue. And then the second, kind of big tension, adding to what Frances said, is really around the criminalization piece. And I totally hear what OA is saying in terms of not wanting to play into ICE's narrative linking crime and sanctuary cities. But I think, on the ground, when we're passing policies, especially policies around local law enforcement and jails, handing over people to immigration, we are talking about people that have had criminal justice contact. And so it's hard to not kind of delve into that when you're doing that work. And I think, especially even if there's a way to do that, you risk then excluding people who say have criminal convictions from those policies if you don't address it. And so I think we've had the same issue of it just being very, each of those systems is so complex and it's really hard to do it in kind of soundbite form.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is getting dark, so let me ask you, Alisa, what are some of the recent successes you've had? I'm going to ask both, Lisa and Frances.
Yeah, so I mean, speaking from, some of our work in New York, I think our policies in New York are really strong and have held up for the most part to the kind of recent spate of sanctuary attacks. And I think one thing, we actually in New York City, our kind of main policy limiting ICE police collusion, we went back 2-3 times. And so the very first version of it was very limited. On a policy level, but I think one thing that our coalition did really well was keeping our messaging really strong. So we never said, oh, only innocent people, like innocent people will be protected from ICE, or making those distinctions, people with low level convictions. We always talked about, the moral reasons to have the policy, talked about people being able to contribute to their communities, ICE is a bad actor, racial profiling, and where resources could be really going to, have true safety. And so I think that has sort of allowed us to go back and now have, one of the strongest laws in the country. And I've seen that play out in a lot of different places too, where people are really standing strong. I'll just give maybe one other example. I think using politicians' rhetoric around their commitment to sanctuary has been really helpful in pushing them on criminal justice policies. So taking folks that are coming to this place of like, we want to stand up to Trump and we want to have a pro-immigrant agenda, and saying, well, actually having broken windows policing or having disproportionate targeting of communities of color for drug offenses funnels people into the criminal justice system and puts them on ICE's radar. And so we've seen the district attorney in Brooklyn started this Justice 2020 committee to relook at kind of every criminal justice policy. We'll see how that plays out, but we've seen kind of more support for drug decriminalization, vacating old warrants, and really pushing back on some of these policing practices. So I think that's been a real success from that.
Thank you. Frances, thank you, Alisa, very much. Frances, what about you? Recent successes, and then I'd like to turn the webinar over to our questions from the audience. But Frances, can you maybe break down a little bit of what some recent successes you might have had?
Yes, I think when you talk about success, it's always about how do you define success, right? And I think defining the immigrant community, defining success for themselves, especially in a place like Texas, is extremely important, because if we were just to go down a list and check off how many protective policies we've been able to enact, we've been with us before, we'd be probably depressed about the whole situation. But what's really, I think, is what's powerful to me and keeps me hopeful, and I know that we're going to have a really change of the tide soon, is that the community is fighting back. This community is fighting for these policies and pressuring and pushing local officials. I think you're going to see hopefully some positive change in Austin, Texas soon, where I think is the place that's more progressive in Texas, where we can do more. In places like Houston, though, and Dallas, people forget that these are major cities. Houston's the 4th largest city in the country with the most diverse community in the country. And that when we talk about these issues, slowly elected officials are starting to realize that there's just no option in protecting our community because we are so diverse. And today, specifically, just extremely proud of the community power that was shown just as we were speaking. There is an action at a local high school where students walked out of the high school demanding that one of their friends be released from detention. And that issue is exactly what we're talking about, is uplifting the issues of the impacted community. A young student who was arrested and sent to ICE and is now detained in ICE, and seeing how families and people can be destroyed and their communities torn apart. And so the fact that these young people are not standing by and that they're organizing. And then more importantly, I think that's exciting is that people, again, as we're talking about racial profiling, the immigrant community and other communities of color and the queer community and other communities that have been attacked by Trump in the last year, coming together in a way that I don't think we've seen before, and understanding that we must work together because all of our issues are tied into these systems of oppression that are really meant to destroy our communities. And so I think that although it can be challenging, the community spirit is really, I think, the biggest success and what brings me hope.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you. On that note, I'm going to turn the webinar over to some questions from our participants. We have one that I want to direct to Lucy. Lucy, some groups are talking about the value of family, right? So sometimes they define family connections as a right. What does the research indicate in terms of countering chain migration language to family? Widely shared value. Is family, a widely shared value?
Thanks, Michael. That's a really great question. Unfortunately, the research was completed in June 2017, so we didn't focus specifically on family reunification. So we can't necessarily speak to that specific question, but what we do know is to, just the clearest advice we're getting from our partners is to avoid all uses of the word chain migration. That is a anti-immigrant frame. It's family reunification. And so chain migration is just it has so many negative connotations, and it just isn't necessarily something that we want to reinforce in our messaging, in our language. But that's a really great question. I wish I could speak a little bit more towards that.
Yeah. This is for the entire panel. What are the coordinated efforts from sanctuary cities, from mayors, to ensure and influence better sanctuary policies in each area, and also getting more cities to join in? Can anyone sort of speak to that or address it?
This is Ana Maria from CPD. So we have been working closely with a network of local elected officials called Local Progress. It's mostly city legislators and some mayors that are working on advancing a set of policies to protect immigrant communities in these moments. And so out of the network functions both kind of as a learning space, a strategy space, and a community for legislators who are trying to kind of learn from experiences across the country. So that network is working closely with also a network of mayors that Mayor de Blasio has created called Cities for Action. And out of those kind of spaces have emerged few kind of replication ideas of sanctuary policies and other kinds of policies, including access to counsel and other kind of pro-immigrant policy agendas that are kind of just as important as the kind of protection and defense from the encroachment of federal immigration enforcement.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Ana Maria. You thought you were going to give the opening speech and then stay quiet. Lucy, we have a question, I think a little bit of a clarification. What does the percentage of media coverage mean in the content analysis part? The percentage of media coverage of what? Surely not 22% of all media coverage in February 2017 mentioned sanctuary cities?
No, that's a great question. So the random sample was based on specific search terms. So we were searching for media coverage that had specific reference to sanctuary cities, sanctuary policies, sanctuary jurisdictions. So this is 22% or whatever percentage of media coverage related to sanctuary jurisdictions specifically. So 22% of media coverage of sanctuary cities focused on public safety and the rule of law, 18% focused on defining sanctuary cities, another 16% focused on, XYZ.
Okay. Thank you. That clears it up. We were talking a little bit earlier about SB4 and alternative terms for sanctuary cities. I think, Lucy, we were using sort of sanctuary cities, sanctuary jurisdictions sort of interchangeably. Are there some alternative terms that we should be using?
Well, I think this is, I could say that both Frances and Alisa have alluded to the fact that the term sanctuary cities and welcoming cities has become somewhat problematic, and I think it really is going to be, dependent on your audience. So, in Houston already, welcoming cities is something that it seems to have already adopted negative connotations. That may not be true for another jurisdiction. So, I think I can speak to more broad recommendations, which is that the co-opting of terms and the co-opting of movements is something that always happens. And so the ability to tell effective stories is always going to be the kind of tool that you use to challenge. And so whether we switch from sanctuary cities to welcoming cities to another phrase, that new phrase will be co-opted, which means the story that the opposition is telling may just be more effective. And so we need to figure out a way of, I think that may be a shorter term fix to the issue, switching to another term, but it doesn't actually change the underlying issue, which is that the criminalization of immigrants is really an effective way of really reaching malleable audiences when it comes to a lot of these issues. But I would love to hear from the other panelists, because they're the ones who are really on the ground dealing with this in their day-to-day.
Me too. Alisa, Frances, can you comment?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the storytelling. I think that it's been apparent, around the SB4 issue, and I think that, how we relate, and you're exactly right, like the audience matters. It depends on who you're talking to, and for example, even elected officials around SB4 were talking about public safety, and there was a huge decline in the number of people, victims of domestic violence, that were calling and reporting crime right after SB4, and the decline, I think, is still continued. Especially with folks from the Black community, they understand what that means, and that helps them connect to the stories of the immigrant community. So I do think that I agree. It's going to be hard to always find a one word or one term that's always going to work, but I think it's an evolving kind of process and it's really about who the audience is.
Alisa, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we got to wrap up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, we've been doing a lot of work in trying to get ICE out of the courts, and seeing that as another wedge and a kind of next step or another phase of sanctuary work. And I think, like Frances was talking about, bringing together different groups of folks, judges, community-based organizations, survivors of violence, who, initially ICE it became a big issue because they targeted a survivor of human trafficking. And so that was this one narrative. But then I think we brought in all these other groups to say, yeah, that's important and really terrible. And also they're targeting folks with criminal convictions who have a right to access their court date and things like that. And so just kind of adding some complexity to the narrative, I think, can be really helpful.
Alisa, thank you very, very much. Well, we have 1 minute left, so I'm going to have to wrap up. Thanks again to Lucy and Ana Maria, Alisa, Frances, and everyone who's helped, and for our panelists for sharing their knowledge with us today. If you have any questions about today's material, feel free to reach me, mjackson@opportunityagenda.org, or Elizabeth Johnson at ejohnson@opportunityagenda.org. We're also going to be sending you a link. I think someone asked this question. We're also going to be sending you a link with the recording as a follow-up, so you can share that with any colleagues who couldn't make it today. Finally, as you close out GoToWebinar, a short evaluation. It's very, very short, everyone. Will pop up. Please fill that out so we can make sure that we're offering you the best possible content in the future. And with that, I will let you all go. Thanks again, and happy Valentine's Day.